Okay, so I hope you all got your work sets in on time. Your next work set is available, work set 2, and is going to be due next week. And it's going to be based on stuff that we're doing today. Are there any questions? You'll get your work set back with comments. I don't know, Eric and Colin, are you planning to post solutions? We don't usually post solutions because I guess everybody will have slightly different diagrams. There's some things that if there's a part of it, like a math part, we can post a solution to that. Okay, so we can do that. Okay, I just screwed that by mistake. So today we're going to talk about biological control, and we're going to talk about host parasitoid models, which is a way of modeling organisms that are in a prey-predator type of interaction. And this work goes back. The first models were thought about in the 1930s, but then people started making a more serious effort in the late 1960s. And the models that I'll present here sort of traditionally were around in the early 1970s and have been used to try and understand this whole question of biological control. So Berkeley was once upon a time one of the centers for biological control in the world. Some of the early cases going back to the beginning of the 20th century. And we used to have a division of biological control at Berkeley in the 1960s, 70s, and 80s when there was a Department of Entomology. Now the Department of Entomology and all people who study insects have been folded into environmental science, policy, and management. But at that time, there were about 40 people in the Department of Entomology and a separate division of biological control. But now the center of biological control in California are at the 2 agricultural campuses, which are Riverside and Davis. And this particular document comes from UC Davis, where there is a Center for Integrated Pest Management. And you can read it just out of interest. It talks about the types of natural enemies, pathogens, the difference between pathogens, parasites, and parasitoids. So anybody have any idea what the difference between a pathogen, a parasite, and a parasitoid is? Who's heard the term parasitoid? Okay. And pathogens and parasites? What is the difference between a pathogen and a parasite? Yeah? Okay. Yeah, that's a good way to distinguish between them. Pathogens don't necessarily kill their host, they make them ill. And individuals can recover. And pathogens are usually thought of as viruses and bacteria. But parasites is a more general term that sometimes includes pathogens, but also includes multicellular organisms like nematodes, cestodes, roundworms, flatworms, all these things that are multicellular and typically live inside you and use you as a resource. So pathogens also use us as resources. Everything uses us as a resource that lives within us, and we have lots of organisms, and we have more cells living as part of us, our ecosystem complex. You can think of yourself as an ecosystem for bacteria, and only 1 in 10 cells belongs to you, and the other 9 in 10 belong to other organisms. And we're finding it's pretty important to maintain these ecosystems of bacteria because they do a lot of stuff for us, particularly in the digestive tract, but also living on our skin. They help regulate a lot of things, and they help keep us healthy. And part of the problems today that people think of with regard to hypersensitivity and asthma, all these sorts of things, are because we're not exposed to enough of these, the diversity of particularly parasites, like worms and things like that, that normally are biologically part of any mammalian organism. I mean, you probably know your dog has worms, and you deworm your dog from time to time, and maybe your cat. And also your children get dewormed from time to time. But these help to prime your immune system. And if you stay in too sterile environment, then some of the allergies that we have in the modern world, and asthma and sensitivity to allergens, might come from a hyperactive immune system that hasn't been primed properly. So if you see small kids eating soil, it's usually a good idea to let them continue just doing that, as long as it doesn't contain mercury and toxic chemicals in it, which a lot of soil does these days. So there are lots of different kinds of parasites. Now, there's this group called parasitoids, and parasitoids are unique in that they're typically organisms like the organisms they attack. So you get wasps attacking wasps, or wasps attacking other insects. And parasitoids typically will lay an egg in a host, and the egg will develop, and the host will continue to live while the egg's developing until the egg gets sufficiently big that it pupates, and then the host may die, and then it emerges from the adult. So usually a parasitoid, one parasitoid comes from one host. There are parasitoids where several parasitoids come from one host, and there are even these things called polyembryonic parasitoids, where one egg is laid, but that one egg makes a clone population of several hundred individuals, and they emerge. And so in that case, the wasps that attack their hosts are much smaller than their hosts. But very often it's this one-on-one thing. So a predator typically, in its lifetime, will kill a lot of individuals, and needs, so like a ladybird or a lion, whatever, needs regular meals, and every time it needs a meal, it needs to go and kill something and eat it. With a crocodile, it may only eat once every several months. But certainly throughout its lifetime, it consumes lots of individuals. So the ratio of predators to their prey, there have to be many more prey per predator, otherwise the predators could never survive. On the other hand, parasites, usually a host can have many parasites inside, and they're just living there, and they're trying to manage the host as best they can. So they don't want to kill the host, because if they kill the host, they kill themselves. They want to keep the host alive and pump out a lot of eggs. And this is the case, say, with malaria. Malaria is a parasite, and it lives within you, and then you have these periodic outbreaks of fever, where the malarial parasite is going through a life stage, where it's mating with inside you, and it's producing a whole lot of young, and then the mosquitoes come, and they suck up your blood, and these young parasites are then transferred to another individual. So the mosquito, in this case, is a vector. And then, of course, with bacteria and viruses, you get billions and billions of them reproducing within you, and depending on their life history, they can either get transmitted by making you cough or sneeze and infecting other individuals. In that case, it doesn't really pay them to kill you, because if they can keep you sneezing for a long time, they can get transmitted to a lot of individuals. So a highly virulent virus usually is not optimally adapted from an evolutionary point of view. And so the famous case is myxomatosis in Australia. Anybody know about myxomatosis in rabbits and what happened there? So somebody released rabbits in Australia thinking it's a great idea, because then you can make rabbit pie, and you can have all these rabbits. Well, what happened is these rabbits got out of control, and they eventually started covering the whole of Australia and degrading the ecosystem. So this is a typical case of an invasive species out of control. And the reason why it's out of control is it doesn't have any natural enemies to actually keep it in check. So in Europe, the rabbits are kept in check by foxes. There weren't any foxes to do the job. So somebody got the bright idea that as a biological control agent, they would release a disease. And they released a virus called the myxomatosis virus. Now, this virus was very effective and initially started out killing rabbits at a very high rate. But then what happened was those rabbits who had a less virulent strain, who weren't killed immediately, were more likely to pass on their virus to the next generation than those who were killed very rapidly. So the virulence of the virus actually got less and less virulent over time. And so initially, the virus, if it infected a rabbit, might have been killing 80 or 90% of them, and later on, it was a much lower rate, maybe 20, 30%. So this is typically what happens. So if Ebola continues to spread, then the strain of the virus that is most likely to spread is going to be one that is less likely to kill you. Yeah. Well, so the growth of the rabbits was incredibly rapid because of the high rate of production. But then you've got to look at the mortality rate versus the growth rate and how. So does this disease attack individuals before they can reproduce? So for example, why has evolution not weeded out heart disease in humans? And that is because it attacks individuals who already reproduce when they're old. This is why evolution doesn't make us live forever. It's easier to get rid of individuals and make new individuals than to try and keep repairing them all the time. And so that's why evolution has these cycles where selection is strongest on any traits that affect reproduction, post-reproduction. And one of the most interesting things in humans is the selection for menopause in females. And that's not seen in almost any of the other mammalian species. I think there may be one or two, I'm not sure. But they have to be very long-lived, and it has to be an advantage for females to live well beyond their reproductive age. And what it's thought of as in humans is that it's important for females to have support to raise children. And they can either have support from a mate or they can have support from their mothers. And because mates are not very reliable and mothers are much more reliable, so menopause was selected for. So remember, your mother is more important to you than your mate ultimately. Keep forgetting that. Okay, yeah. Yeah, the rabbits are still there. But if you go to a lot of countries, there's this big invasive species problem. Plant species are much worse than mammalian species. But on some of these islands, for example, rats have been introduced and they're killing the local bird population. So many birds, especially ground nesting birds on islands, are highly threatened by the fact that rats were brought from people who in the 18th century and 19th century came on ships and visited the islands. But you have, for example, a lot of vegetation that we see is not native. And vegetation across the whole of the world is becoming a little more homogenized because we're moving around all kinds of grasses and trees that are non-native species and they disrupt the ecology. But one of the biggest reasons why invading species are successful initially is because their natural enemies have not come with them. So rabbits were successful because foxes weren't brought in. They decided not to bring foxes in, but rather bring disease. And so that was an interesting experiment. Now, so you can go through this and you can have a look at all the different kinds of insect parasitoids and also predators. So there are two things. There are parasitoids and they're predators in terms of introducing other insect species to control pests. So for example, ladybird beetles can control aphids, but also they're little parasitoid wasps that can control beetles. So parasitoids belong to this group, is the name for this group that lays its egg in another individual, and the egg develops and then kills that individual. So it's an obligatory killer, whereas diseases, pathogens, don't have to kill their host, and in fact it's better for them not to. It depends on the kind of disease. So for example, anthrax. Anthrax is highly lethal. In humans, you can treat it very easily with antibiotics, but if you're not treated with antibiotic, it will kill you. And the reason why is that anthrax is not transmitted from one human to another by coughing or in bodily fluids, but rather the individual dies. And what anthrax does is it prevents the blood from coagulating. It makes these spores that spill out into the environment, and then somebody else comes and picks it up in the environment. So anthrax, in fact, doesn't want to keep its victims alive. It wants to kill them in order to complete the cycle. So if you get pathogens like anthrax, then they have to be effective at killing. So you can read through this and have a look at a number of different biological control systems and what makes an effective natural enemy. You can also go to some websites. So here's a website. Again, Wikipedia turns out to be a pretty good website. And I'll just go through some of the things that are talked about at Wikipedia. So there are a number of issues involved in biological control. And here's just a list of these. In order to practice biological control, if you want to you can't just introduce an organism into California. If you think that there's, for example, a Mediterranean fruit fly, let's go get a parasitoid that would kill that fruit fly. Maybe you introduce an organism that then turns out will kill other beneficial insects, may kill a lot of bees that are natural pollinators. So that's bad news. So in order to introduce a biological control agent, it's a highly regulated situation. You have to get an importation permit, and then you have to keep the organism that you import in a quarantine facility and see how effective it is, and then try it out on some other organisms that are closely related to your target organism, but that you don't want it to attack, to make sure that it doesn't attack those organisms. Only once you've gone through that process can you then release the organism as a biological control agent, and you have to consider all these issues. And the different kind of control agents are predators, parasitoid insects, and diseases. And among diseases, they're bacterial, fungal, and viral diseases. And then there are all these issues that relate to ecological questions, direct control, indirect control. So you can read up all this stuff And here you see the life cycle where a biological control agent lays its egg in a host species, in a host individual. And so we're going to discuss that in the context of trying to build a very simple model. And here's the rabbit example, where it was seen as a major pest in Australia and New Zealand, and that's also discussed. Some of you might not know this, but the cane toad also turned out to be a major pest in certain areas of the world. And I guess the answer to the cane toad is for humans to eat them. So there's not enough of that going on. You've heard me talk about eating insects, but eating frogs can also be pretty good. How many of you have eaten frogs? Yeah, I mean, taste like rabbit. You go to a French restaurant to get offered frog. Okay, so in order to understand and to build these models, we have to discuss a little bit about random processes. And the reason why we need to discuss something about random processes is that these models involve ideas about selecting things. So, for example, if you have a number of parasitoids flying around, and there's a tree over there and there's some larvae that these parasitoids are going to attack, or aphids. A parasitoid has a certain number of eggs that it can lay. Let's say it has 10 eggs. So its best strategy is to put one egg in each of one different host. That way it'll attack 10 different hosts. Typically, if it puts all 10 eggs into one host, only one of those eggs will survive. So in many of these host parasitoid systems, if 2 eggs are laid in the same host, the egg of the parasitoid young that hatches first will probably kill the other one when it hatches because it's slightly bigger. And it may end up eating it as well. So it's kind of the first in is the winner. So if you've got a certain number of eggs that can be attacked, or larvae that can be attacked. If you look at the parasitoids, there's some parasitoids that lay their eggs on eggs or lay their eggs on larvae. Let's rather draw larvae. A larvae is just an oblong egg. And along come these parasitoids, and there's several of them, and they can now put eggs at random. They can attack these larvae, and then another parasitoid can come along, and it's got red eggs, and it can ideally put one that doesn't have an egg in, or it may end up putting an egg in one that does already have an egg. And so if there are N larvae and R eggs, how many larvae will end up with no eggs in them? How many with 1 egg in them? How many with 2? How many with 3? And how many with 4? So this is why these models are important, because we have to know how to allocate R things into N containers in order to solve that problem. And there are a lot of problems in modeling and in the world that fall into this type of problem of allocating a fixed number of things into a fixed number of containers. And these generically in mathematics are called the urn problem. And the urn problem is if I have a certain number of urns and a certain number of balls, and I place balls at random in urns, how many of my urns are empty, how many have 1 ball, how many have 2 balls, how many have 3 balls. So you can go to Wikipedia and read up about urn problems, but that's, of course, a general kind of approach, and we're interested in a subset of those problems that lead to what's called the Poisson distribution. So in the Poisson distribution, the idea is that you have, and I'm going to use the notation that I have here, I have n balls, and I'm going to put them into m boxes, or m urns. So the larvae are the boxes, and the parasitoids' eggs are the balls, and I want to put n balls into m boxes. And so you can calculate lambda as equal to n over m, which is the mean number of balls per box. And so this is an important parameter. And so if you've got a certain number of balls and a certain number of boxes, you know that there's going to be an average number of balls per box. But that's not what's interesting. What's more interesting is the distribution, which turns out to be a histogram. Now, if you've got... Can everybody see that, or should I make it bigger? I'll try and make it bigger. Okay. If lambda is large, and you've got a lot of balls and few boxes, so you've got 10 times as many balls as boxes, then the mean number of balls per box is going to be somewhere around 10. But some boxes will get 9, some will get 11, and some may be empty, but very few, and some may get as many as 20. However, if lambda is small, like lambda is equal to 1, then in this case, it turns out that many of the boxes, close to 40% of them, will be empty,